Good evening and welcome to the City of Pasco Council Workshop Meeting. The council thanks you for being part of our city government. At workshop meetings, the council discusses issues, but no formal action is taken. Washington State, per federal guidelines, has lifted the requirements for face coverings for vaccinated individuals in most situations. Therefore, council members, staff, and the public who are vaccinated may attend this meeting without a face covering. Those individuals who have not been vaccinated will need to continue to wear a facial mask in their meetings until the order has been lifted by the state of Washington. Agenda packets are available on the City of Pasco's website at www.pasco-wa.gov/agenda. And the City Council workshops may be accessed through GoToWebinar. This workshop is also being televised live on Pasco TV, channel 191, on Spectrum Cable in Pasco and Richland, and is streamed on the city's Facebook page, website, and YouTube channel. This and previous council workshop video is available on the city's website. And lastly, the public may submit their comments and or questions by contacting the city manager or city clerk or using the feedback form on the city's website. And with housekeeping out of the ways, can we all rise for the flag salute, please? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you for that. And now we'll move on to a roll call.
Councilmember Alvarado.
Present.
Maloney.
Present.
Milne.
Present.
Roach.
Roach is excused tonight.
Serrano. And
He's also excused tonight. Thank you.
Mayor Pro Tem Barajas.
Present.
And Mayor Martinez.
Present. Thank you for that. And next, we'll go to verbal reports from council members. Anybody have anything they'd like to report to the public that was done last week? If not, then we'll move right along. Items for discussion tonight. We have a railroad quiet zones presentations, and we're gonna turn it over to Mr. Worley. Director Worley, do you want to start us off with that tonight?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of council. Tonight, we are going to hear a presentation from Tammy from the FRA. She has information from Tammy Wagner from the Federal Railroad Administration, and she is going to provide us some information about quiet zones. There's been a lot of comments from the public recently about the noise coming from the trains within Pasco, and so she's going to be providing us information about what, if anything, can be done about it. So with that, Tammy should be online this evening. Are you available, Tammy?
Yes, I am. I hope you can all hear me.
Good evening. Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, it's my understanding that John is going to pull up my presentation.
Or is that you, Rick? Perfect.
Okay. Okay, so I was contacted by Steve, Mr. Worley, to talk about quiet zones within the community of Pasco. So what I want to do is just kind of give you an overview of the Federal Railroad Administration's requirements for implementing a new quiet zone. So this is the presentation I have is just going to give an overview. It's very complex regulation, and I can certainly, adhere to any practices or policies or questions that you folks may have after my presentation. I guess if you wish to interject during any point in time, please feel free to do so. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Next slide, please. So we do have the regulation that was promulgated in 2006 that allows communities to establish quiet zones. The regulation also requires train crews to sound the locomotive horn for every public highway rail grade crossing unless it is established within a quiet zone. So I'm going to go through some of the protocol that must be in place and, strategies, the assessments, the inventory, and what we do with the quiet zone process. So next slide, please. Okay, so I visited with Steve regarding crossings to be proposed for a new quiet zone And, there's criteria that the quiet zone must be half a mile in length, I'm sorry about that. And public and private pedestrian crossings within that corridor must be included. You cannot, designate one crossing without another if that quarter mile or half mile radius does exist. So each crossing has an a DOT crossing ID number. That's always 6 numbers in an alphabetical character, and you're going to see that at every public, private, pedestrian crossing. It's the blue and white sign that is, it should be fastened to the active warning device or to the crossbuck post. Next slide, please. Okay, so we highly recommend quiet zone diagnostic reviews for every proposed quiet zone. That way we work with the railroad, the local municipality, state DOT. In this case, you're going to work with the Washington UTC to make sure that everything is in place before the quiet zone is implemented. And we take a look at nearby intersections, commercial driveways, risk assessment, how many accidents have occurred at a particular railroad crossing. We take a look at crossing closures. All of those issues are brought to the table when we do the diagnostic review. And we highly recommend that all parties participate so everybody has the same understanding of what has to transpire to implement a quiet zone. And of course, public safety is at the utmost importance for all of us. So I guess next slide, please. Here we talk about the length of the quiet zone. Every quiet zone is based upon each railroad corridor. So when I did some preliminary findings for the Pasco crossings, I realized that this would have to be 4 separate quiet zones. That means 4 separate risk analysis. And the basis for that is we have 4 different corridors. Each one has to be a single quiet zone. Again, we look at a half a mile in length. Basically how it works is a quarter mile from each end of the railroad crossing to achieve that half a mile distance. And then continue on, I'll get to the private crossings too. Next slide, please. The Federal Railroad Administration does not regulate private crossings. So if we have any private crossings within a quiet zone, that's when the diagnostic review is required. We get all the parties involved to determine what type of safety measures are required for private crossings. Each railroad crossing has an inventory assigned to it. Like I said, the DOT number, all of that information is recorded on the FRA website. We have the database that lists the type of crossing, what active, passive crossing warning devices exist today. We take a look at the number of tracks, the number of lanes of roadway, nearby intersections, of course, stop signs, pavement markings, everything that is, and if I encourage you to take a look at our database because it's just a wealth of information regarding railroad crossings. Like I said earlier, each public, private, pedestrian railroad crossing is required to have a DOT number assigned to that. If not, we work with the railroads to get that completed. And the community or the designated public authority is required to update the inventory when a quiet zone is implemented. We'll get into that in greater detail a bit later. Next slide, please. Warning devices. Minimum requirements for a new quiet zone include all public crossings being equipped with flashing lights, gates, constant warning time, power out indicators. And for those of you folks not familiar with those types of technology, the power out indicator is the light that is attached to the silver shed along any crossing that has the active warning devices. Constant warning time is a type of train detection that indicates the speed of the train, distance from the crossing, and it basically dictates when the lights and gates should begin to flash and then the gate arm comes down. It's roughly about 20 seconds prior to the approach of the train. So we work with the various partners to make sure we have the required minimum warning devices in place. Again, your railroad folks, your state agency, whether it's the UTC or the DOT, we get those individuals involved right from the beginning. Next, well, I should back up here a minute. Constant warning time, the train detection. Again, it says if reasonably practical. So if we have a crossing that has minimal use, for instance, 2 tracks, one is a spur, one is a siding, one is the main line, that may not require the constant warning time. But again, we as the diagnostic team do the assessment, determine what is required, what is reasonably practical. Next slide, please. First notice that is required to achieve a quiet zone is the notice of intent. And that's completed after we've conducted the diagnostic review. We've determined appropriate safety measures, whether it's 4-quadrant gates, if we can secure a crossing closure, channelization down the center of the roadway, any of those items. So once we've made that decision of what can be installed, what should be installed, in order to achieve an acceptable risk rating, we move forward to the notice of intent. This is a very complex process too. We get all the parties involved. This is the official notice that says FRA and all safety partners, you know, the community is proposing a quiet zone at these crossings. And you list the safety measures that are proposed as well. The document is sent certified mail to all parties. There is a 60-day comment period, and rest assured the railroads will always comment, yay or nay, but they always do require or highly recommend additional safety improvements, because when you silence the horns, there is a 66.8% increase in risk without that locomotive horn. So that is why we will do the risk assessment, and I'll show you how that is performed in just a little bit here. Next slide, please. Private crossings, I said our agency does not regulate private crossings. We do the diagnostic review. At a minimum, the private crossing must be equipped with crossbucks, stop sign, the no train horn sign, and then any additional safety measures that the diagnostic team does recommend. In some cases, if we have a private crossing that goes into an industry or any type of high profile business where we've got ethanol, propane, or anything coming in and out of that, we certainly may recommend additional active warning devices if they do not currently exist. Again, we talk about the 1/4 mile in length for a private crossing. So if we have a private crossing that exceeds a 1/4 mile from the nearest public crossing, it cannot be included unless we search out, you know, additional crossings within a mile or 1/2 mile or however, but that is something that the diagnostic team looks at. Next slide, please. And this is what the no train horn sign looks like. We also have the crossbuck, or I should say the RXR circular advanced warning sign that is required at every crossing, public, private. So once this quiet zone is established, the no train horn sign must be placed at every public and private crossing. And we take a look at pedestrian crossings as well, if that is warranted, dependent upon how that pedestrian or trail crossing is utilized. Next slide, please. Here we get into the pedestrian crossings, and again, we do the diagnostic review to determine how that pedestrian crossing is used, whether it's a trail crossing that's used regularly. If we've got a crossing that goes to a nearby school, shopping mall, what have you, we do take those serious. And maybe rather than just the passive crossbuck sign, we would consider installing pedestrian gates, mazes, those types of things to prevent any tragedy with the pedestrian, bicyclists, what have you. And again, we take a look at MUT, some compliant warning devices. But at a minimum, again, we're going to need the crosswalk, the no train horn sign, and then also the RXR, railroad crossing ahead sign. And that's for pedestrian crossings. Next slide, please. Supplemental safety measures, SSMs at all crossings. There are 3 methods to achieve a quiet zone. If a community decides to install safety measures at every crossing, they're certainly welcome to do so. With that type of quiet zone achievement, it's a 5-year review to make sure that the safety measures are compliant. And how that works is the notice of intent is submitted. There's a 60-day comment period, and then the safety measures are installed. FRA gets out to those particular crossings, does a final inspection to make sure they are compliant. Safety measures such as non-traversable curb medians or channelization down the center of the roadway must be 100 feet in length from the gate arm back, both sides of the crossing. If a commercial driveway or nearby intersection does exist, the community can consider the SSM supplemental safety measure at an acceptable risk rating. And that becomes a bit cumbersome for folks not familiar with that particular process. But I'll definitely work with the community if they choose to pursue the quiet zone. All right, we'll go to the next step, please. The risk index. So when you silence the horns, as indicated earlier, there's a 66.8 increase in risk. So how do we compensate for that? Again, we install the additional safety measures. We look at crossing closures, the channelization, the non-traversable curbs down the center of the roadway, 4-quadrant gates, anything that will help reduce that risk. And there is a risk reduction percentage based on those particular those additional safety measures. Next slide, please. Okay, and so this is the quiet zone calculator that is used to determine the risk evaluation for every quiet zone. So what has to happen here is a community official, or if you hire a consultant to move forward with the quiet zone process, they basically select all of the crossings to be included in each quiet zone. We want updated traffic counts, train counts, and then there is the risk that you will see on the, let me just look here, on way to the right of your screen there. There's the risk as it is today with the horn sounding. So what we do is we actually take a look at whoever is working with the community to help establish a quiet zone. When you see the modify button, they can install 4-quadrant gates, and that will give them an 0.80 or 0.82 risk reduction, 0.70, 0.75 for the channelization, non-traversable curb medians. So you modify that, and that would bring down your risk level. And so in order to achieve a quiet zone, we take a look at the quiet zone risk index. If it's below the national significant risk threshold and below the risk index with horns, that would be acceptable for a new quiet zone. This is quite a complex process, and we do work with the communities early on to help assess that risk. Let's go to the next slide, please. Excuse me. So here you basically notice of a quiet zone establishment. Once the community has decided what safety measures were installed, we do the risk calculation that was noted on the previous slide. And final notice is the notice of quiet zone establishment that indicates everything is in place. It advises the railroad that they have 21 days to cease the routine train horn soundings. And I want to clarify routine train horns because train crews are allowed to sound the locomotive horn for any unsafe situation, whether it's pedestrian near the crossing, motorist stalled on the tracks, roadway worker, if we've got folks working near the crossing, anything, deer, wildlife that could certainly cause any type of incident at that railroad crossing. Malfunctioning warning devices is another one. So the quiet zone, excuse me, establishment is sent again, certified mail to all partners. The state DOT, UTC, community officials, our railroad, our agency, and that all is archived within the FRA database for quiet zones. At this point in time, it's a 21-day notice. In some cases, railroads with different crews along each rail line, it may take longer to obviously observe the quiet zone, but we work with communities in the railroad to resolve those matters. Next slide, please. Supplemental safety measures, I talked about those earlier. The approved safety measures, crossing closures, it's a permanent closure. You cannot leave the roadway open for pedestrian, or the sidewalks open for pedestrian crossings. It has to be a permanent closure to motorists and pedestrians. The other approved safety measures, 4-quadrant gates. We take a look at one-way streets, that is approved. And then I've talked about earlier, the channelization, and then non-traversable curb medians or mountable medians down the center of the roadway. So those do have a risk reduction evaluation already. Next slide, please. Okay, these are just some photos of the channelization and the non-traversable, non-mountable medians that are basically installed for quiet zones. We're preventing motorists from going around the lowered gates when the train horn is no longer sounded for routine movements. And there you see the RXR. On the right of your screen, the RXR circular MUTCD compliant railroad crossing sign. Below that is the no train horn sign, and that is a requirement for all quiet zones. Next slide, please. So when we can't achieve the 60 feet of channelization, or we have issues with a nearby intersection or commercial driveway within 60 feet, we move into the alternative safety measures, ASM. And I talked about 4-quadrant gates having a 0.80, 0.82 risk reduction in cases where we have, maybe we can only get 10, 20 feet of channelization or non-traversable curbs. There is a method to determine a lesser risk reduction, and that's, we work with the community or their consultant to determine that risk analysis. So just know that there are other options for securing a quiet zone when you have nearby intersections or commercial driveways. Now, if this was in a residential area, you still are committed to installing the 100 feet of channelization or a non-traversable curb median. Next slide, please. Any quiet zone that isn't implemented, there is a periodic review. If safety measures are installed at every crossing, it is a 4.5 to 5 year review. If the community chooses to install safety measures, I'll just say at 3 crossings out of 5, it's a 2.5 to 3 year review process. We take that very serious. We want to make sure the safety measures remain in place. There is no concern regarding safety for the motoring public or the pedestrians. And it's amazing when we say, I should have stated that non-traversable curb has to be 6 inches in height. So if the community is doing a roadway improvement and they install an overlay of 2 inches, that is no longer a compliant quiet zone. That particular concrete non-traversable curb would have to be modified. And again, we work with the communities to determine what actually has to transpire. But just know that if a quiet zone is implemented, we constantly work with communities and there is that update process. Next slide, please. And it shows some of the issues that we've encountered with quiet zones. If community installs channelization, sometimes in the winter, Midwest conditions, you receive issues such as at the top left-hand photo where the channelization devices may have been knocked down by snow plows or trucks or high-profile vehicles. In some cases, on the upper right-hand side there, you see where, again, a community did a roadway improvement project, failed to install the channelization devices. This would be automatic, immediate termination of the quiet zone, and the routine, or I should say, the train horns will begin sounding immediately. Bottom center there, the non-traversable curb median or channelization must start at the lowered gate arm. If not, we will come out there, do an inspection, and the community may have to do some altering of that safety measure. Next slide, please. Okay, there are issues where a quiet zone may be terminated, and unfortunately, I've had to experience some of these with my 20-year term with the FRA, and it is not fun. Once communities established a quiet zone and it's been implemented for 10, 20 years, the last thing you want to do is go to a community and just say, you've lost your quiet zone because the risk is too high, your safety measures are no longer compliant, what have you. But how it works is the FRA will send a letter to the community. They have 6 months to respond to our agency as to how they will improve safety. And then they have another 2.5 years to implement and install the safety measures. But if it is a severe or critical issue, the quiet zone may be terminated until, immediate action is taken and we have additional safety measures installed. So just know that it may not be there forever if circumstances do warrant or we have an increase of collisions. Next slide, please. And that is it. So I will entertain any questions at this point in time.
Well, thank you, Tammy, for the presentation. I actually have a question that maybe Mr. Worley could answer. Do we have an inventory of how many crossings we have in the city of Pasco?
Tammy was very kind in doing that research for us, and we have a group of them right in that one area of town. And Tammy, can you correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there's like 3 or 4 in that near area. Is that correct?
I pulled the data. It would be 4 separate quiet zones.
Okay.
And are you talking about the South First Street?
Yes.
Or what corridor?
Yes, it'd be that First Street.
First Street, we would have 1, 2, oops, let me look here. I think we had 4 crossings just for that particular quiet zone.
And have we had requests from the public about, do we have like a consistent complaint about the noise?
I think what I've heard is council members have been receiving comments from citizens who have said, hey, these train horns can be pretty loud. What, if anything, could be done? And so we thought this would be a great opportunity to share with council what would be required for one approach anyway, and that is to develop a quiet zone.
Sure. Okay. Any other questions from council? Mr. Alvarado, Councilmember Alvarado.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you so much for the presentation, Ms. Wagner. I certainly appreciate the careful attention to balance of safety and enjoyment of life in our neighborhoods. My question is, so how do these typically get initiated? Is it an agency or a municipality that does this, or is this a public group that does kind of a more grassroots approach, or both?
It has to be somebody from within the city, the, public works director, mayor, whomever. But one thing I should have mentioned when I did my crossing inventory review of the 5 crossings along that First Street, none of those are equipped with constant warning time. And that is a very expensive type of train technology. And that means, and correct me if I'm wrong, if any of these have lights and gates, I need to be corrected. But when I looked at the inventory, there was 1, 3, 4 crossings along that First Street corridor, and none of those had the constant warning time, active warning devices, lights and gates. So that is roughly, at a minimum, $250,000 to upgrade per crossing. And that will escalate depending upon the number of tracks, nearby crossings with the interconnection. And I can't provide that cost estimate because that's a railroad cost, we don't get involved with that.
And a follow-up question, I guess, related to your last comment there. I assume that the Federal Railroad Administration would have some significant time devoted to, all the mailings and all the notification, things like that. Is there a administrative cost to the city from the Federal Railroad Administration?
We do not charge, but the community, if you choose to hire a consultant or have somebody within your city or a council member perform those tasks, that would be up to you. But there are consultants that do work with quiet zones, and you would pay their fee to
Thank you.
do so.
Thank you. Councilmember Maloney.
Thank you, Mayor Martinez, and thank you so much for this presentation. Very informative, and appreciate the level of rigor that goes into what you do. So what I'm looking at this, I guess what comes to mind, following on to one of your responses to Councilmember Alvarado, was indicating that there's certain safety measures that we don't currently have at some of these crossings. So I assume that those would, even without a quiet zone, are something that improves the safety within those intersections. And I know that's something that's moving into that we are experiencing some amount of additional development in this region. So is there a way to understand how the safety implications of installing that sort of safety measure as it stands, regardless of quiet zone?
Yes, I work with many of the state departments of transportation, in your case, the Washington Utility Transportation Commission. And basically how crossings are upgraded to active warning devices, meaning the flashing lights and the gates and the constant warning time, is based upon, unfortunately, incidents that have occurred, number of vehicles per day, number of trains per day. And so there is a formula that is used to get those upgraded. And I know the state agencies have a formula, they have a process, a 5-year plan for implementing, or I should say upgrading crossings. And unfortunately, we have some Section 130 monies that are available, but it's very minimal when you take a look at 220,000 crossings throughout the United States. So if you've got a high profile, I should say, maybe a high-risk crossing that you feel is warranted for an upgrade, and I can ask the Washington UTC or the DOT if they have any plans for making improvements, adding lights and gates. But when you've got minimal traffic and train volumes, it's not at the peak of their, implementation plan for improving crossings.
Great, thank you for that additional information. Now, Mr. Worrell, I'd be interested in following up on some of those conversations with you as we talk about some of the development, especially towards the Osprey Point location, in terms of what's going on there. That's a significant amount of potential additional traffic and in some areas pedestrians, and I would hate for us to be, I'd be excited for us to be ahead of the game on making sure that we understand that, especially as developments occur, and whether or not any of the concurrency could help us make sure that those safety measures are being taken care of with the development. So, thank you.
You bet. If I could make one more comment, I think one of the unique things about this particular area in Pasco is it's right at the BNSF yard. So trains are entering and exiting a very major yard within our area. And so it might, I don't know what the changes in the requirements might be, but it's not like other places where trains are just flying by at grade crossings and just not having to blow their horns. So they're actually slowing down to enter into the yard, and they're actually going pretty slow to exit the yard and then gain speed as they head on out. So I don't know how that plays into it, but it's a pretty unique situation compared to other ones that I've seen.
Let me comment on that, if I could. So how would I say, the railroad operations movement within the rail yard, train crews are required to sound when they start moving the train or when they're entering the facility. So that it made me at one blast to alert the crew members on the ground that train is moving. If it's one blast, two blasts, I don't know about the BNSF yard protocol in that area, but that sounding will continue with or without a quiet zone. Just to make you, I just want to bring that to your attention.
All right, thank you.
So that not remove that from a quiet zone process.
Okay. Councilmember Milne.
Thank you, and thank you, Tammy, for such a good presentation. I know you guys were following or kind of talking about this. What is the average speed when the trains do leave the yard or come into the yard? I've been caught behind that crossing on A Street numerous times, and it seems like it takes forever. Do you have an idea of how fast the trains are actually going through that crossing?
I do not have the required train speed, or I should say the allowed train speed, but they're, if they're slowing down for the yard, that's maybe 5-10 miles per hour, and then they're accelerating to get through town. So again, it's based upon the weight of the train,
Okay.
the length of the train, and the speed along that corridor.
Okay, and then I guess my second question was, I was kind of curious, also probably staff knows this more, but as far as complaints, I live in West Pasco, and I've heard trains from Kennewick cross the river, and I was actually surprised that I could hear a train go there, but my job or my work is in downtown Pasco, and I've never once heard a train, leaving the yard or coming into the yard. So I was just kind of curious, are we having complaints from downtown Pasco? Any businesses that are complaining about the trains, or is it just more of a residential consumers that are on A Street or in that vicinity, or does anybody know that?
Yeah, Councilmember Maloney?
Yeah, I can certainly speak to, we've gotten some emails from residents. I can assure you, I can hear them at my house on a regular basis, often in the evening. So I'm in my bedroom and I can hear the train horn sounding, and I'm a bit further west than where you work. I assume that you have a solid building, and that's probably helps a lot. But certainly I can hear it. It's not disruptive for me. I'm far enough away that's not a big deal, but I certainly notice on a regular basis. So just as my perspective, what I see. Thank you.
I was curious.
All right.
Thank you.
Councilmember.
No, just wanted to add to Councilmember Maloney's about the proximity to the railroad. So I'm on 7th, and if I'm not mistaken, it's on 4th, correct?
I believe so.
Yes, and so I'm very, very close. I do hear when they arrive, when they leave, I hear it all. Yes, we do have complaints from residents, and those residents are along First. So but again, you need to take into consideration that our residents on First are a little bit older. So the age difference there is different from your other neighborhoods where Mr. Maloney might live or where I might live. So those are the differences there. But yes, the complaints have been, the emails that complaints have been consistent. And so it's something that should be taken into consideration, but I do appreciate your presentation. Ms. Wagner, thank you very much for that.
All right.
You're welcome. I just will educate you folks in your city as well that, the required train horn soundings by the train crew, they're required for every public crossing to sound the horn, and it's 2 long blasts, a short blast, and a long blast. And that pattern may be duplicated depending upon, the speed of the train again. But if you've got nearby crossing, in this case here, when you've got crossings like 0.23 miles away or 0.3 miles away, it may sound redundant, but they're required to sound in that fashion.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Mrs. Wagner, for this presentation, and then I think Mr. Worley, there's no question that this is a health issue, obviously. When the trains go off in the middle of the night, or even in all times of the day, when it wakes some people up who can't sleep, it becomes an issue. Anyway, it's really interesting because I came from a little town of Mesa where a railroad, the train came by every 5 minutes, and it was unbelievable how the trains would go by and I wouldn't even hear them anymore. I mean, it would just not be there. So in many ways, it's just amazing how different it can work for so many different people. But nevertheless, I think this is something that we need to be thinking about for our residents and doing whatever we can to develop and create these quiet zones, as we can afford it and we can find funding for it. So, anything else anybody want to bring up?
Just a quick question, Mayor, and Mr. Worley, this might be a question for you. Now, Tammy mentioned that as trains approach the rail area, where they do their stop. We cannot implement quiet zones, correct?
I think we could probably implement them, but it wouldn't change
It
the
wouldn't
rules that the railroads use to enter or leave the yard.
Okay, so basically the concerns that we've heard are in that proximity area. So it would not make much difference to the individuals, correct? Mr. Maloney, Councilmember Maloney?
I guess my perspective is that it might lessen it, but there's no magic bullet here, and I think that's the key, is that
Right.
this is a complex issue and it's safety, and because it's so safety related, we need to protect our people in all the ways we can. So I don't think there's any easy, perfect answer here.
Right.
So I think that's what I heard, and I appreciate that
Yeah,
perspective.
just wanted to reiterate what was mentioned and basically.
That is correct. Excuse me for interjecting, but that is correct. I receive a lot of train horn complaints near rail yards, and there's no stopping the railroad operations for entering or exiting that rail yard, or movements within the yard, moving cars and so forth.
All right. Well, once again, one more comment?
I was just gonna thank Ms. Wagner once again. She is actually 2 hours ahead of our time, so a special thanks to her for staying up late and providing this presentation for us.
Yes, well, thank you very
You're
much.
very welcome. Thank you.
All right.
If you have questions, just call me or email me, Mr. Worley, and we'll get it figured out, okay?
That
Good luck
sounds
with the
great.
process there.
Thank you.
All right, thank you for that,
Hang on.
Mr. Wardy. Well, next we'll go to the next item on the agenda, and that's the utility extension in the unincorporated island and urban growth area. Excuse me, Director White, would you like to kick us off with that one?
You bet. Thank you, Mr. Mayor and Council. This item involves a multi-dimensional policy discussion for utilities within the urban growth area. I think Council is well aware that over the past several decades, much of the UGA, both north and south of 182, have been provided with at least city water in some manner. The area north of Burns Road, that just occurred roughly within the last 10 years or so. But in Riverview, it occurred over many decades, spanning at least 30 or 40 years. We did receive a recent request for Spencer Estates 4 that you can see in the screen here at the very far left portion of the screen. It's right at the end of Burns Road. And we thought that it would be a good time for council to take a much broader look at the policy implications of extending city utilities, particularly given the recent expansion of our urban area that occurred when the county adopted our comprehensive plan in June. The unique thing about Spencer Estates 4 is that unlike many of the other subdivisions that you see on the screen, it is not benefiting from a utility extension agreement that was executed years ago. So this one's kind of new. However, it is in the old 2008 urban growth area, which is distinguished, of course, from the new urban growth area where there aren't any developments or city services. One, and the agenda report is very extensive relating to the policy implications, but obviously the bad effect of uncoordinated and unplanned growth is sprawl, which results in a higher tax burden on all city residents. And the council, through the comprehensive plan and in various policy implications, has indicated that we need to place increased emphasis on increasing density within the urban area because it's a very cost-effective way of providing those urban services. And as you know, the urban growth area by definition is a place where those services can be provided in a cost-efficient manner. So what I've done is listed a series of policy subjects at least, and hopefully council will consider those and offer any input that you feel is appropriate. The first of those is annexation. And the question is, should annexation be a prerequisite for the extension of city-provided utilities? The second item is density and utilities. Will urban densities, generally 4 to 6 units an acre, be required as a condition of city utility extensions? And will provision of sewer be required as a condition of extending sewer or city water? There's also a paragraph directly underneath this bullet that talks about the phasing of urban services, and particularly the difficulty of providing sewer service after retrofitting it after water has been provided. And that comes out of guidance from the Department of Commerce through their growth management handbook. The next significant policy issue is development standards. And will city development standards apply as condition of utility agreements? And then likewise, directly underneath that are mitigation fees. So will mitigation fees apply as a condition of extending city utilities? These would generally occur through SEPA or in conjunction with an individual utility extension agreement itself. There's a considerable discussion on applicability. The Pasco urban area contains obviously the city of Pasco. It also contains the unincorporated Riverview Island right in the middle of the city, and then much of the city limits now reflects the Riverview Island from a few decades ago. Within the Riverview area, not all of the homes are connected to city water, but you've heard me say many times before, development patterns that were allowed in the former Riverview County Island and in the current County Island make a challenge of every single permit application, let alone an overall policy regarding city utility extension within the county islands. That can be distinguished from the former 2008 urban growth area, much of which you're looking at right here on this overhead map. That was provided with the assumption that septic systems would be used, and they were often accompanied by specific utility extension agreements that allowed that. So there may be some areas where sewer could be a consideration. It would certainly, though, be a very, my guess is, complicated analysis to come to that conclusion. And then the next area of council interest in the UGA is our new urban boundaries that, whoops, oh, I guess there's just one slide there, but they're significantly north of the slide you see on the screen. And of course, there are no urban services and there is no urban development. So those are essentially the farmlands that comprise roughly 26 or 2,700 acres of our future residential expansion area. And those are clean slate. That's a clean slate. We have concluded, at least from a staff recommendation standpoint, that within those new UGA areas, simply requiring annexation is probably the wisest course of action, at least for staff to recommend. So again, each of these categories within the existing urban area are unique. The site-specific request for Spencer Estates 4 falls in category 2, the former 2008 urban growth area. And with all that on the table, staff would definitely appreciate council's thoughts and considerations for where we should steer our policy regarding utility extensions.
Thank you, Mr. White. Councilmember Maloney.
Might as well dive right in, right?
Take a crack at it.
All right, thank you, Mayor Martinez, and thank you, Mr. White, for bringing this forward. I mean, I know we've touched around this, especially in the Riverview area, for years, and the idea of who should be paying for infrastructure, and so this is a really complex issue. But to me, my thought on how to proceed is pretty simple, and that's that we need to protect our current taxpayers and our current city residents. And the way we do that is that growth needs to pay for growth. It's that core principle. You build a house, you should be paying for the infrastructure and requirements for that. And so when we're looking at this in our UGA, these properties will at some point in time be within the city. all of them will be at some point in time in the future. And if we don't build them to our standards, if we don't make sure that they're helping pay for parks as they're being built, et cetera, then these facilities, they're going to ultimately be a responsibility the whole city's going to have to recover from, in essence, into the future. And that'll tax everyone who's been here for a long time, who's had a house for a long time. And to me, that's a pure matter of fairness. And so I guess my basic premise of this is, yes, we should look at annexing the properties whenever possible. That should be a requirement as necessary, especially the undeveloped land redevelopment, especially in the Riverview areas. And that's not, there's no one size fits all there. And I think it's a basic principle, but we need to be careful on how we burden developers and property owners there. But certainly undeveloped land, that should be annexed, held to our standards, should pay for the infrastructure and impact fees. Again, new houses, more development, more houses means more kids, which means more schools. It means more parks. It means for all these other things, and that ultimately, I don't think our current taxpayers should be burdened with those costs and the increased utility rates that would go along with it, with us all having to pay for what a few new growth are developing. So, I guess is that. Mr. White, did I miss anything? Is that sufficient, what I can provide?
No, I think that's a sentiment that I certainly will strike a chord with many on staff, and at least I don't know about council. However, I did want to mention that in some cases, and if you look at the street pattern, for example, north of Burns Road, given half-acre lots, given the septic systems, even though they have city water, some might conclude that it is not effective to annex those properties either now or in the future. Certainly, extending sewer to those subdivisions would be probably a very painful experience given the existing development patterns and the fact that you're abandoning septic systems, you're tearing up roads, you have a connectivity issue with much of the street system that is probably problematic for getting sewer to and through in a very effective manner. So, yes, I would agree.
So just to speak to that, Mr. White, I agree and understand, but this leads us to the same problem what we face a bit in the development to urban standards for the Riverview area, right? So we might be talking 40 to 60 years down the road. Certainly, I wouldn't expect in the next generation that a lot of those property owners will be hooking up to sewer. But we know that's been attractive to some people is once their septic system needs to be replaced, if there's a nearby sewer line, hooking them up to sewer is easier for the property owner and cheaper ultimately for the property owner. I guess I don't want to force the existing developments that already have access to city water to force them to hook up to sewer, but expanding it in their general vicinity and around that, and so that when the time comes that they may be interested in that, or that future developers and future property owners may be interested in subdividing those plots and adding additional density in those areas, as we're seeing in the Riverview area, that having those services nearby would be important to make sure that happens. I guess if that's helpful and clear.
If I could add something on that thought, Councilmember Maloney, the Department of Commerce's GMA Urban Growth Area Guidance document sort of talks about the interplay there and how when you designate an urban growth area, and your capital facilities plan, it's no coincidence that the two are related and that you're sort of presupposed at that point through those planning documents to be extending these urban level services to all areas within the UGA on this sort of 20-year planning horizon that you create. And so where you inherit these parcels that are on, things like septic, the Department of Commerce suggests that, having some mechanism like when they go to subdivide, you can have them connect to sewer at that point to sort of remedy the problem and not just having them, rip out those septic systems when they're not asking for some form of a development permit. I think another component of this we need to think about too is how we're going to process these utility extension agreements. Not to add another layer of complexity, and Mr. Director White did a very good job of laying out the issues here, but currently our code doesn't really have a mechanism for staff to effectively respond to these requests for utility extension agreements. My understanding, looking at our code and understanding the role of council with respect to staff, is right now council is the body vested with the authority to sign these agreements. Other jurisdictions have delegated that authority to their planning staff, either their city manager or one of their department heads, like Public Works, so that they can enter into these agreements with the development community consistent with all their designations under the Growth Management Act. And in doing so, they have ordinances that sort of lay out what the guidelines for these agreements are going to be, so the development community isn't in the dark either. They have clear direction about, is annexation going to be required? Am I going to be required to obtain the necessary easements? Am I going to be required to build to, city design standards, connect to sewer? All those things can be sort of laid out clearly in an ordinance, so that, everyone's on the same page when they go, and then they submit an application. They get all that information to planning staff at the beginning, so they can expeditiously process these permit applications for these UEAs. And so that's another component of this, is how are we going to handle this, when the rubber hits the road as well.
Great, I appreciate those additional thoughts, and certainly I don't expect this to be the final conversation we'll be having about this, but from a, what I understood Director White might be looking for is sentiment from the council as to where you're going left, or are we going right, or are we going straight forward, and so I hope that those details, I'm sure, will come back to us as they get worked out at the staff level once we, might cross my fingers, once we've tied our conversations.
Yes,
So thank you.
City Manager Dave Zabel.
Good evening, council, and I just to weigh in just for a minute too. So this is, I think it's a bit of an evolution as to where we were, and you see all the half-acre lots and so forth north of Burns Road, and those are possible because we entered into an agreement with a property owner out there that allowed them to build a water line up there, and the city in that agreement basically said we would supply water. Didn't have the conditions that we're talking about tonight that was in Mr. White's agenda report, and I don't know that the city was thinking about it quite in that way back in those days, and you can kind of see this was the result. You have a cul-de-sac that's, almost 3/4 of a mile long, not a lot of connectivity out there. And it kind of, it obviously is a very popular area and very developable area. And we lost an opportunity to have that sewered out there because of the extension of that water line 8-10 years ago. So there's a few remnants out there. Burns Estates Phase 3, for instance, that's part of an already preliminary approved plat. So that's kind of a given that's gonna be the last piece of that Phase 3. Spencer Estates, that's sort of up in the air, and that was not part of that original agreement. And I don't want to get into necessarily specific parcels, but so it's, what this will look like to council is as we start to shape the policy, I would assume we'll probably get quite a bit of input from the development community and property owners, I'm sure there as well. And we're also going to go probably through some growing pains as to, in this, the two areas with partial development, like the Riverview areas, and the old UGA areas, the last properties within there that have not, and those haven't developed. Those are issues that probably will come up to council. They may come out as a specific parcel, or they may just come out as sentiments towards staff because somebody did something that they really didn't want to do, and it cost them more money. So it's kind of the rubber where the meat meets the road thing. I think everybody can agree on the new UGA areas, that all should be annexed, it all should be sewered, and with city domestic water out there all at the same time. And the city should, I think, take a pretty firm hand in how that develops out there. So that's all. I just wanted to add that bit more context. So
Thank you, City Manager Dave Zabel. Well, obviously, it's a very complex situation, something that we'll have to talk about, as time goes on, but, and get more input from the community. But I'm kind of in the same sentiments as Councilmember Maloney. It just has to be balanced, to make sure that our citizens aren't paying more than they have to just to add those types of services somewhere else. But at the same time, we have to think about the cost effectiveness of it when the time comes that we're going to be providing these services for those developments. So I know that's not answering a question tonight, but I think it's just something we're going to have to be talking about more and getting more information as time comes. Anyone else? Councilmember Alvarado.
Just a quick comment. I think the more that we move towards kind of a more uniform way of building, I think the better off we're without really having a lot of discretion from staff levels that will change over the decades and things like that. And so I think that's really important to have some set standards that everyone can agree to.
Thank you. All right. So with that, this is a workshop for the city council. Mr. Zabel?
Mr. Strong said, I don't believe we necessarily mentioned we would speak or have audience participation tonight, but that we would be speaking to it tonight. So I'm sorry if I did not convey that, because typically we don't have audience participation at a workshop, yeah. Let me suggest, if you could do that in writing, and Rick, Mr. White, and I will certainly be happy to meet with you too, and we'll figure out a time where you can make a case to council on these policies. All
right, thank you. Could you say, there you go. Thank you, sir. All right, so next, we'll just continue this on and get that information provided, and then we can meet again on this certain topic. All right, next we'll go to the next agenda item, and we'll go to Mr. Director Worley about a resolution, amendment number 3 to professional services agreement for the West Pasco Water Treatment Plant expansion phase 1 with RH2 Engineering. Mr. Worley.
Good evening again, Mr. Mayor and members of council. This item is to talk about an amendment to the contract we have with RH2 to do some additional work on the West Pasco Water Treatment Plant expansion. We entered into a contract with RH2, and as you can see in the information presented to council, this is the third amendment. And I wanted to kind of explain that a little bit. A lot of times when we go into these large plant expansions or utility expansion projects, we're not quite sure of everything that's needed yet. We kind of have to get the consultants started on it. And then as they learn more about the existing facility, we start realizing what some of the needs are in order to do what we want to do. So in this particular case, we knew we wanted to enlarge the capacity of the West Pasco Water Treatment Plant from 6 million gallons per day to 12 million gallons per day. But the very first part of RH2's contract was to go in and look at what would that take. And what they came away with was, wow, there's a lot to expanding that plant. It's not just a simple throw another rack of filters in there and call it good. There's a lot more associated to it than that. So we've split the project up, and as we work our way through the design process, we identify needs throughout the project. And so this amendment to the contract gets very specific about what's needed to get to the first phase of the West Pasco Water Treatment Plant expansion. There are 2 more phases of the expansion that are related to getting us to 12 million gallons per day. And then there is a final 4th phase, which we can do a little further in the future, which will get us to 18 million gallons per day. But everything that we're doing in this phase will help us get there. We can produce 12 million gallons of clean water. Then we have to go to how do we get that 12 million gallons of water out to the system? And then how do we clean the filters so that we can continue to do that? So that's kind of a brief synopsis of why we're coming at you with a third amendment to this contract. So we do have one of our senior engineers, Brittany, on the line. If you have any really technical questions, we'll bring her on board to answer them for you. But with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have if I can.
Thank you, Mr. Wardy. We'll start with Councilmember Alvarado.
Yeah, so some really technical.
Okay.
You're not gonna get from me.
I have to call a friend.
I guess where I'm at is, this is a point we really would just need to trust staff that, that we have local experts that will be able to say, yeah, this is what we need. And if that's the case, then it's good with me. I really wouldn't be able to get to anything technical other than just staff being able to confirm that that's the case. And I think that's where I'm at. But I guess all I need is a thumbs up. Like, yeah, we've done our controls and that all pencils out really well.
Yes, I can tell you that from where I sit, the consultant that we have contracted with for this work is top notch. They know their stuff very, very well. They've done the analysis necessary to get us where we need to be. And so I trust their work, and I would recommend approval of moving forward.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Councilmember Varela. Councilmember Maloney.
Thank you, Mayor Martinez. So Mr. Ward, as I'm looking at this, so we have exceeded, this proposal will put us above our original estimate and budgeted estimate that we originally had in our approved budget right now, right?
Correct.
I know, and obviously, especially when you're doing something as complex as this, we understand that it's not like you just add in 50% more capacity and ta-da, you're done. It's not
Right.
quite that simple with evolving standards. Is the estimated cost of construction also increasing at a commensurate rate? Are we exceeding our budget in both design and construction costs and build costs at this point, or can you help me understand the full picture?
I think I can. I'll try. First off, I would say that a lot of times when we put our initial budgets together, we are not quite sure of everything that's needed inside the plant to get to where we need to be. So we put what we would call placeholders in the budget, knowing that we have work to do. And so then when we get into the design phase, all of a sudden we start learning, okay, this is what we need to do and this is how much it's going to cost. So it gets better defined the further we get into the design process. With that, then we are able to add that to the budget, add it to the CIP. We are also able then to go after low interest loans and potential grants to help offset that additional cost as well. And you'll notice in this particular information, we do note that there is a Department of Health low interest loan for $5 million for this phase. We do anticipate we'll be able to get other ones from Department of Health, so that helps a lot. But then there is also the issue of inflation. And the longer we wait typically to do these improvements, the more expensive it gets. So what we thought might be the cost a couple of years ago is probably higher cost today than what we thought previously. And if we wait a couple more years, it may be a little higher just because of inflation.
So I guess where I'm at is, we've seen some where we've kind of missed on the low end on a number of these things, or we've had to do amendments along the way or budget adjustments. And I know there's some good reasons, and I don't want to suggest that this is like we're out of control or something like that. But I guess I want to understand better outside of this project, kind of as we plan for our CIP, what goes into that, because it gives me some heartburn to say, okay, we've approved the CIP for the next 5 years. We know what we knew then. And then to see things increase from there is something that I guess I'd like to understand if there's a different approach we could take to do the CIP that would take into account that some of these additional risks that we know we might realize along the way. And so I'm okay with this. I understand where we're coming from in this particular matter, and I don't have any further questions on this, but I would guess as part of that, I'd like to continue to have that conversation as to how we budget. And so we're not having to see the number go up and up, and we're holding ourselves as accountable as our people would like us to.
I can tell you just real quickly that a lot of the information related to these big public works projects are related to the comprehensive plan that's associated with that particular utility. So typically we will go to the sewer comp plan or the water system comp plan in this case, and look at what our consultant identified as the future needs, and they put a cost associated with that. That's typically our starting point. But recognize that that's a very high planning level cost estimate. And so we're now getting into the details of that, and that's why it's a little bit different.
Right, but getting into details doesn't by definition require us to go up, I guess is where all I'm saying. And so I just want to make sure that we're understanding that as we're seeing this and we're planning appropriately. So when we're approving something, we understand what the risk is to be actually hitting that number. That's, I guess that's my point. I don't want to see our numbers keep on going up, and that's what we've seen in a couple cases. In a couple cases, we've had bids that have been very favorable, so we understand that we've had some fluctuation, especially over the last year and a half of some large-scale uncertainties with how the labor market and the
Right.
material market is and such. So that's, I guess, where I'm just trying to come from is I want to make sure that we're being prudent. We can hold ourselves accountable for it.
We still have an appointment
We
to
do.
talk about stuff like that.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Maloney. And I don't have a problem with this amendment number 3. I just want to make sure that we don't do something and prepare for the future and then never use it, or by the time we get to it, we're going to have to do a lot of other renovations to get to where we need to be. I just want to know that what we're building and what we're requesting is going to be utilized, and we're not just putting it out there for just in case type thing.
Correct, and I can assure you that we have done some recent analysis with this same consultant for the northwest area of the city and evaluated what is necessary to serve the area that is now in the new urban growth area boundary as part of the comp plan. And so the analysis that they've done for the expansion of this water treatment plant takes all of that into consideration. So unless Pasco stops growing, all of the improvements that will be done will be used in the future.
Okay. All right. Any other questions from council? If not, then we will look forward to seeing that for approval on the next meeting. Is that going to be coming in the next meeting, or?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you. All right. Next, again, we'll continue with Mr. Worley on a resolution bid rejection, Burns Road Pathway Phase 1, Broadmoor to Road 90 project.
Yes, good evening again. This is a project that council had identified as part of our CIP, and staff prepared the plans and specs, and we bid the project. The timing of the project, the work that's going on, the contractors that are catching up from COVID-related backlogs, we feel like the price that we received in the bid that we got is higher than what we think we should award this project at. And so given the budget that we have identified for all 3 phases of this Burns Road Pathway project, we believe it would be in the best interest of the city to reject the bid for this and rebid the project later on, where we can get through this summer and allow contractors to plan for next year. And our thought is that we would take this Phase 1 project and possibly combine it with the Phase 2 project, which would be from Road 90 to Road 84, and bid them both at the same time, and sometimes we can get a better bid by making the project slightly larger. So we're thinking that this would be better for the city to be able to reject this one and try to do it again later.
Thank you, Mr. Worley. Anybody have any objections to that? All right, then is this something that's going to go on the next agenda meeting for the bid?
That'd be
rejection?
great.
Okay, we'll look forward to seeing it then. That one's a little bit easier. Okay. All right, great. Now we'll go on to next in our agenda item, a miscellaneous council discussion. Do we have anything that we need to bring up within the council? City Manager Dave Zabel, have anything you'd like to?
The only thing I'd like to point out, and the chief's not here tonight, but he sent me a note yesterday that our testing out at the CBC West testing site is over 600 tests yesterday, and that's the first time we broke 600 since February 2nd. So I think that, we were down to, 100 to 200 a day down there for quite a while. So I think that's indicating pretty heightened awareness in our community.
Yeah. So, thank you
Just
for
share
that. And I have noticed as I travel Argent frequently today, all day long, there was a long line of cars at the test site. And, in a way, it makes me comfortable that people are actually being careful, want to go get tested. in another way, I'm kind of worried. I don't want to take a step back, back to where we were. We're so, it was really interesting to see how fast we can go and try to make things back to normal. And it's definitely something we don't want to step back and have to make, some other arrangements to fight this thing. But I'm getting this good feeling that the community is getting better educated, and I would actually encourage many to really seek in getting the vaccinations if you haven't got them already. So anyway, thank you for that information, City Manager Dave Zabel. Yes, Councilman Maloney.
Thank you, Mayor Martinez. Mr. Zabel, on that point, I know that very recently the Department of Health shut down the vaccination portion of the CBC site. Have you heard any news from them of whether they plan on reversing that conversation and decision? I think they ended all pop-up sites and the site at CBC, or do they feel that private providers are sufficient?
I can't speak for them, but I know that was the thought when the numbers had kind of gone down on the pop-up sites and at CBC West. I could certainly check into them, or Chief Gear I know is in touch with them as well. And they're throwing a lot of support towards the private providers, so I'm not sure what effect that's had as well. So we can get you a little bit better insight into their strategy, if you like.
Thank you, Mr. Zabel. And I guess I just appreciate sensitizing them to the fact that I think a lot of community members found the drive-up vaccinations to be effective if they were interested in getting the vaccine, and that to be very efficient for them as well. So if that's something that we have a significant interest, I believe I saw a study that said that Franklin County is one of the lowest vaccinated in all of Washington State, if not the lowest. And so making sure that those tools are available for those who want it is still, I think, really important. So I'd encourage any conversation to include making sure that our unique community needs are being well served by the state. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Maloney. So with that, if there's no other miscellaneous items, we will go to item number 7, and there is a need for an executive session tonight. And the executive session will be to establish the sale price or lease amount of real estate per RCW 42.30.110C, and consider acquisition of real estate per RWC 42.30.110B. So with that, City Manager Dave Zabel, do we have an estimated time that we'll need for executive session?
Well, it shouldn't be more than 15 minutes.
Okay.
If I may, Mr. Mayor, I was aware of the potential conflict of interest, so I'll be abstaining today from the conversation.
Thank you for making that noted. We'll get that noted, and so the rest of us will go into executive session. So it is 8:18. We'll be in executive session for around 15 minutes. So with that, this meeting is adjourned, not adjourned, but we'll go into executive session and we'll adjourn when we come back out of the meeting. So thank you. All right, so we are now out of executive session, and it is 8:28, and this meeting is now adjourned. So thank you very much, and see you next week.